Everybody? Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco. And just as the title says, it looks like Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was more about semiconductors, which is something that her and her husband are heavily invested in. But let me tell you guys a story first about how TSMC, which is a semiconductor manufacturing company based in Taiwan, is currently the leading semiconductor manufacturing company in the world. And they are competing with the US based semiconductor company, Nvidia. And Nvidia is a company that Nancy Pelosi and her husband are heavily invested in. Another competing semiconductor company is SMIC, and that's a semiconductor manufacturing company that's based in China. Now, China would benefit a lot if it were to have more control in the semiconductor industry, and they can't do that through Taiwan. They would benefit more if it was their company that they have more control over, SMIC, if that became the lead. Now, let me share with you guys some articles, because really what this has to do with is following the money, right? As credit to my boy Robbie Yeager from the MCSC network, we've broke down a story about Nancy Pelosi and her husband very seemingly receiving insider information before they sold their stocks. Now, this seems to have happened again. Here they did it when they bought Microsoft stocks before a huge military contract story. Now, here, Pelosi's husband sells off up to $5 million worth of chipmaker stock ahead of semiconductor bill. So the House was trying to pass a semiconductor bill. Now, let me read to you what that was all about. This is from The Hill. So her and her husband sold up to $5 million worth of shares of chipmaker Nvidia as the House prepares to vote on a bill focusing on the domestic chip manufacturing industry. Pelosi completed a period transaction report signed on Tuesday that indicated that her husband, Paul Pelosi, the guy who loves to drive drunk, he sold 25,000 shares of Nvidia at an average price of $165.05 with a total loss of $341,365. In total, the shares are worth between $1 million and $5 million. So a separate filing signed by the House Speaker earlier this month indicated that Paul Pelosi had exercised call options last month to purchase 20,000 shares of the chip maker at a strike price of $100. The latest regulatory filing came one day before the Senate passed legislation in a 64-33 vote to provide $280 billion to bolster the American semiconductor industry as the nation grappled with a chip shortage, which was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So it seems like they really want to strengthen the semiconductor industry. And in order to do that, the United States, through their company Nvidia, would have to dismantle Taiwan's company, TSMC. That's the only way that this is going to work. Now, this is, of course, like Nancy Pelosi is going to lie because she was asked about her husband's decision to sell his shares given the timing of the House's vote on the CHIPS bill. And Pelosi spokesperson Drew Hamill told The Hill in a statement, Mr. Pelosi bought options to buy stocks in this company more than a year ago and exercised them on June 17, 2022, as if he couldn't receive information back then and still receives information now, right? As always, he does not discuss these matters with the speaker until trades have been made and required disclosures must be prepared and filed. Mr. Pelosi decided to sell the shares at a loss rather than allow the misinformation in the press regarding this trade to continue, he added. Paul Pelosi's trading has been under previous scrutiny, including from Republican lawmakers like Senator Josh Hawley. Now, we're not going to get too much into this here, but there's been just like what I brought up earlier, right? There's been plenty of examples in which Pelosi and her husband sold stocks just before something big happened that benefited them a lot. They always sell their stocks at a very convenient time. Well, not always, but a lot of times that seems to occur for the Pelosis. Now, following Nancy Pelosi's visit, look what happened, guys. The stock market for semiconductors, it went down. So the Taiwan Stock Exchange weighted index slipped as much as 2.1%, and Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing dropped as much as 3.1% before paring losses to 2.38%. So if geopolitical tensions escalate as Pelosi's trip takes place, more downward pressure could hit local stocks, which have already taken a beating through 2022. The benchmark weighted index is roughly 20% from the peak it hit earlier this year. Now, then we look at who she visited when she was in Taiwan. She visited the TSMC chair, Mark Liu, in Taiwan. Now, TSMC, again, this is the chip manufacturing company based in Taiwan. They are the number one providers of chips to Apple. And Apple is another company that Nancy Pelosi and her husband are heavily invested in. So keep those two companies in mind in terms of who the Pelosis are heavily invested in. They're invested in Nvidia and Apple. Now, what this seems like to me is her meeting with this guy, right, it seems like it provides China an excuse to be like, look, we have to further sanction Taiwan. If they're going to do that, it's going to take a lot of power away from TSMC, and they're no longer going to be the lead company for semiconductors. So it says here, Mrs. Pelosi and Mr. Liu will discuss implementation of the recently passed CHIPS and Science Act, which provides US $52 billion of US federal subsidies for domestic chip factories. The report said, citing people familiar with the matter. Now, currently, like I said, TSMC is the main provider of chips to Apple. Wouldn't it benefit Pelosi a lot more if Nvidia became the number one semiconductor manufacturing company, and then it started manufacturing chips for Apple instead of TSMC? So this article points out how it's a double-edged sword for Apple to be dealing with TSMC. And I want to point out something here from this article. Let me look for it. TSMC's handling of Apple as a client. Where'd it go? TSMC's handling of Apple as a client further assists in keeping Apple from moving work to other chip producers. But there are other reasons also at play. While Samsung may have the same knowledge in chip production as TSMC, Apple is reluctant to become a customer due to the direct competition in the smartphone industry and previous legal troubles. Intel, which is becoming more of a foundry service provider, has said it wants to bring Apple aboard as a client, but the fear of Intel prioritizing the production of its own chips during a shortage may prevent Apple from jumping ship. While the prospect of Apple jumping ship to another chip foundry may not necessarily happen in the short term, there are still elements that could harm the relationship. According to sources of the report, TSMC is having trouble perfecting its 3 nanometer production process, which would allow Apple to use more energy efficient chip designs in the iPhone and other products. The difficulty will mean that Apple will be trapped on the same 5 nanometer process for 3 consecutive years, a first for the company. There is the fear that the lack of chip progress could rob Apple of further energy savings and performance improvements, which may impact for future iPhone releases. So with this bill that just passed to help bolster the semiconductor manufacturing industry in the United States, that could help Apple to no longer rely on TSMC. And again, this trip that Nancy Pelosi just took, it did hurt TSMC. Now, over on the China side, Xi Jinping, he had just appointed Liu He as the chip czar, and he plans to boost China's domestic semiconductor efforts. So they're also making efforts to strengthen their semiconductor industry, just like the United States. So it seems like both countries, the United States and China, are trying to remove TSMC of Taiwan from being the lead semiconductor manufacturing company. So it says Liu will develop a series of financial and policy supports to boost the sector, as well as help improve Chinese chip design software and extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. So it talks more about that if you're interested. So Nvidia and TSMC, just real quick to give you guys a background on these two companies. Again, Nvidia, a semiconductor company from the United States, is also a tech company, right? It used to not focus on semiconductors. It used to focus on optics and other tech stuff. And they used to be good business partners with TSMC. That was from 2003 up until 2021. In 2021, it's when things went south between those two companies, Nvidia and TSMC. And they became more so competitors. So let's jump back to more of these articles here. Again, there's also a shortage of semiconductors. And this article talks about how SMIC and TSMC have responded to that. So SMIC plans to build a new $8.9 billion factory in Shanghai to produce semiconductors at a 28 nanometer node. That level of technology is suitable for automotive ICs and other semiconductor products that are currently in short supply. It is several generations behind the leading edge, which is now a 5 nanometer and moving to 3 nanometer at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. I want you guys to keep in mind here about how semiconductors and all these chips are needed for the fourth industrial revolution, which is going to ramp up surveillance. Both the United States and China will benefit through the fourth industrial revolution in having more control over their citizens. And you can't deny that China does surveil their people. They do censor information in that country, just like the United States censors information over here. And it's no secret, especially if you keep up with independent media like this, that the United States wants to ramp up surveillance. Here's some more. US to stop TSMC Intel from adding advanced chip fabs in China. So as Congress passed a historic $52 billion federal program to boost domestic chip making capabilities, it included one significant caveat. Companies that receive the funding have to promise not to increase their production of advanced chips in China. It's a condition that will certainly add to escalating tensions between Washington and Beijing. Again, let's not forget, the US and China are still going to be competing. But it's going to benefit them more if they knock out their other competition, which is Taiwan's TSMC. TSMC won't be able to substantially upgrade or expand its existing facilities, effectively losing some growth opportunities in the world's biggest semiconductor market. Specifically, the Chips and Science Act bars companies that get federal funding from the military from materially expanding production of chips more advanced than 28 nanometers in China, or a country of concern like Russia for 10 years. While 28 nanometer chips are several generations behind the most cutting edge semiconductors available now, they are still used in a wide range of products, including cars and smartphones. The band covers both logic and memory chips, on and on and on. So if you want to read more on that, you can find that article on Yahoo Finance. And in response to Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, China has responded by imposing more sanctions on Taiwan. All right, and that's going to hurt TSMC. So, what do you guys think about this? There is more to this trip, right? We should always ask ourselves, Pelosi's meeting in Taiwan. Okay, why Pelosi? Why is she so adamant about going here? Is there there has to be some kind of financial motivation for Pelosi to go here. And now we're seeing what that reason is. Pelosi's heavily invested in Nvidia and Apple. It would be within her and her husband's best interest to knock out TSMC as that competition to help Nvidia. Nvidia then becomes a leading semiconductor company. Then it can develop a symbiotic relationship with Apple, another company that the Pelosis are invested in. Unbelievable, right, guys? All of this, as these companies get more powerful, we become more powerless, and they have more control over us. Our corporations and the government are one. And that right there, folks, is fascism. But yeah, guys, let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And I'll be back with you guys with more news. As always, stay informed.